Hello to everybody around the globe. Hello, Sergey. Thank you for the donation. We appreciate your support on a very ongoing basis. Thank you so much. And let's get to the questions from our beloved audience, starting with Matthew Dillon in Amarillo, Texas. That's a Spanish word, but it's pronounced Amarillo. Go figure. The counteroffensive for Ukraine is catastrophic. Zelensky knows the West will abandon them soon if he surrenders, so he keeps sending untrained, young and old, unwilling Ukrainians to die. Can Russia take Kiev to put an end sooner, or not yet?
Kiev is a very large city with a significant population. In fact, the population of that city far outnumbers the total strength of the Russian army. And I think we need to understand that, one only needs to reflect on how deadly the fighting for Bakhmut was, a small town that ended up becoming the center of attention for both Russia and Ukraine. The urban fighting there was horrific, and the casualties suffered by both sides were extraordinary. So the idea of taking Kiev, I don't imagine that Kiev wants to be taken at this point in time. So it would be a fight that would suck the life out of the Russian army. And right now, the Russian strategy is to avoid situations like that. They're not looking for situations where they will, potentially have horrific casualties inflicted on their forces. They're in the business of killing Ukrainians, and right now business is good. Tragically, it was good in Bakhmut. Upwards of 70,000 Ukrainians were killed there, and it's good right now in Zaporizhia and the other areas where the Ukrainians are carrying out their counteroffensive. Putin has basically said that the casualty ratio is 10-1. So that's just a phenomenal casualty ratio. That means that for every 10 Ukrainians killed, one Russian is dying. And while it's tragic for everybody getting killed, understand that when you go back to World War II and you take a look at some of the big battles that were fought there between the Soviets and the Germans, or the Americans and the Germans, even lopsided battles like the Battle of Falaise Gap, or which was in the West in France, or the basically the collapse of Army Group Center in 1944. The casualty ratios were roughly 1.3 Germans for every one Soviet. And this is while the Soviets are winning, or the same thing, American Germans. So even the big victories in World War II, the casualty ratios weren't as lopsided as 10-1, which should be telling you something about what's going on the front line. This isn't just a defeat. This is a massacre. This is slaughter. This is murder. And who's responsible for this? Anybody affiliated with compelling the Ukrainians to do this, for breathing false hope into them. General Mark Miley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has come out and talked about and bragged about how we being the United States and our partners have trained these Ukrainian soldiers and equipped these Ukrainian soldiers to carry out this task. But the fact is, what we're asking them to do is something they cannot do. Why do I know that? Because I know what it takes to train a combined arms force to carry out this kind of operation. You wouldn't get a Marine unit involved in this unless the average Marine, look, it's 13 weeks of basic training, followed by another 12 weeks of advanced individual training. Then they transition to their unit, where they're going to spend some time, usually about 6 months, getting used to the unit, learning their squad members, learning how to work together. And then they're going to spend 6 months additional training before they're considered operationally ready for any assignment they're giving. So we're talking, a minimum of 1.5 years, 2 years before you could consider putting American forces in harm's way, in order to be trained on the equipment and be knowledgeable of the tactics and operations. And remember, that's not the real factor, because the battalions that these Marines are joining have within them veteran Marines that have been there for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, Marines who know the ropes. And they still need to be trained for 6 months prior to going in because they have to refresh their knowledge. If General Miley took soldiers with a minimum of training, let's just call it 21 days of training, and then we throw them into a unit that's just forming up together, no veterans, they're all rookies, all inexperienced people, and then we take them to Germany where we rush them through a month of training to get familiar with equipment they've never operated before, highly complicated equipment like the Leopard tank, the M2 Bradley, things of this nature that we normally take months to train an American counterpart. We're now rushing them through this training. And then we're throwing in for 1 month of conceptual training for combined arms operations. We get them in the field and let them do a couple fire maneuver things, very basic stuff. Most of their stuff's done on the computer, a German computer called Cora, where they war game things. And the war game's only as good as the data you put in. And apparently the data they put in had all the Russians running away at the first sound of fire, having no artillery supremacy, and had the minefields being breached all the time, and everything worked perfectly. And then we take them and we throw them into combat. And what happens is they don't even get through the initial zone of contact. They run into a minefield. Their progress is stopped. The artillery comes in. They're slaughtered. There's no air defense. So the Russian Air Force is just running amok, killing everything that moves. There's no effective counter-battery fire because the Russians are using counter-battery fire on them. So the Russians are basically just slaughtering everybody with artillery fire. It's murder. And if Miley did this with American forces, Congress would hold an inquiry. Miley would be found guilty of criminal negligence, and a criminal notification or something would be filed with the Department of Justice to prosecute this man for crimes. And this is the reality. General Miley is a criminal. Every American officer that participated in this and gave it a green, give it the green light, give it a stamp of approval, is a criminal. They're murderers. They knowingly allowed Ukrainian soldiers to be put into a situation that they knew would only have a negative outcome. There is no professional in the world who could stand on a witness stand and survive cross-examination from somebody like me, who would challenge every one of their statements about the preparedness of the Ukrainians. At the end of the day, they would all have to acknowledge that the Ukrainians stood no chance, not a snowball's chance in hell, of coming even close to breaching the Russian defenses. So then the question we have to ask is, why did they send them to their deaths? And that's another disturbing question, because if you know they can't win, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of this? And simply the purpose is to kill as many Russians as possible, to ratchet up the pain factor in Russia as high as possible so that the Russians quit. I just came back from Russia, and I'm going to tell you right now, they don't even know how to spell the word quit. They're not considering quit. This nation is more unified than you can possibly imagine around not just the notion of victory, but the necessity of victory. This is an existential struggle for the survival of Russia, and the Russian people know that, and they aren't going to allow anything to happen that breaks this. This is the people that suffered 27 million casualties dead in World War II. I don't think there's anything NATO can do that will break their will to survive. And that's what we're talking about, an existential struggle of survival. And if that's the case, and again, we know this is not an unknown. It's not like, the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department don't have people capable of making the same assessments I'm doing. So it is a deliberate, package of lies that they're telling themselves and telling their government officials to, promote a policy of regime change in Russia, because that's what this is all about, getting Putin out of power. That's the only thing they care about. And they're willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives and inconvenience and displace tens of millions of people for what is in effect a politicized pipe dream, because it's never going to happen.
of Project Aerodynamic and Operation Red Sox concerning the long link between the CIA and Ukrainian fascists to help me get a better understanding of the historical context of the current situation.
Sure. Once upon a time, there was a fascist scum-sucking pig named Stepan Bandera. He had other fascist scum-sucking pigs that they gathered together in something called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. These are white supremacists who got off on murdering people. In fact, when Stepan Bandera was arrested in 1936, I believe, in Poland for murdering people, on the stand, he basically said, "I'm willing to kill millions of innocent people to achieve the objective of Ukrainian nationalism." So now we know his mindset. The Banderas modeled themselves off after the German Nazi movement organization, closely aligned in terms of their thinking, so close that when the Germans moved into Poland in 1939, the Banderists were with them. I mean, and then when the Germans moved into what is now Western Ukraine, but at that time was part of Poland taken over by the Soviets in 1939, one only has to take a look at the rape of Lvov. There's some wonderful photographs, very entertaining stuff of Banderists chasing down Jewish women half naked because they're going to rape them and then they're going to kill them, because that's what Banderists do for fun. That's a fun afternoon. Get drunk, rape and murder Jewish women. And they did it by the tens of thousands because they're really good people. They formed death units. They roamed around and slaughtered the Jews. And then when the opportunity came in 1943, for instance, the fact is, I think maybe just the other day was the anniversary of the Volyn massacre. It's a wonderful thing. It's a good time. They really had fun killing 110,000 Poles. That's what Banderists do. They're murderers. The Banderas also roamed around Belarus. There's a horrible movie that the Russians made, and I can't remember the title of it right now, but it's based about a boy experiencing this kind of stuff. The death squads running around. It's a true story how they stuffed all the members of a village into a barn and set it on fire and burned anybody who dared jump out. True story. Banderists. So here are the worst people in the world, because they literally are the worst people in the world working for the worst regime in the world. That's the Nazi regime. And now the Nazis, they have this organization. It's an intelligence organization on the Eastern Front. It's run by a guy named Galen. And General Galen is using the Banderists as part of his resistance movement. They hunt down saboteurs. They hunt down Russian partisans. They're working hand in glove with the Nazis. But as the Nazis retreat, the Banderists stay behind as a stay-behind element. It's a concept of unconventional warfare, guerrilla warfare. So they become guerrilla fighters for the Nazis, by the way, because that's who they work for. And their job, while they're doing this, is not only to kill Red Army soldiers, but they slaughter Russians, they slaughter Poles. Why? Because they view the Russians and the Poles as subhumans, because they're Nazis. And so Galen's running these guys, organizing them, keeping the stay-behind element working, and then the war ends. Germany loses, and Galen surrenders to the Allies, the Americans. And instead of taking Galen and putting him up against the wall and shooting him, as we should do, because he's a war criminal, a Nazi, instead we take him and his entire organization, murderous Nazi thugs, and we say, you now work for us. And all those Bandera scum that you've been running, who are murdering Poles, murdering Russians, they're now going to work for us. The OSS, which became the CIA. And that's what this is all about. The CIA used Galen organization to coordinate with the Banderists, who are operating in Poland, operating in Ukraine as a stay-behind force to fight the Soviets. And from 1945 until about 1953, 1954, there is a very violent war. How violent, you might ask? I don't know. During that period of time, around 250,000 Russians were killed. That's a lot. Around 48,000 of them were Russian soldiers, which tells you that there's a lot of fighting going on. Around 200,000 Banderists were killed, too. This is big fighting, guys. This isn't little stuff. This is big stuff. Now, about 1953, 1954, the Soviets finally get the upper hand, and the Banderist resistance is stomped out. About 150,000 of the Banderists are captured by the Soviets. Off they go to the Gulag, where they belong, by the way. Everybody's like, oh, the Gulag was full of innocent people. Not in this case. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Sent away, 25-year sentences. The other about 150,000, 200,000 fled to the West, where they were welcomed with open arms by the Germans, the Nazis, who loved the Banderists, by Americans. Remember, I just want to remind people, 60 miles away in beautiful Ellenville, New York, there's a monument called Heroes Park. And in Heroes Park, there are statues to 5 Nazi thugs, including Stepan Bandera and people of his ilk. And every summer, the wonderful Ukrainian American people come together dressed in their brown Nazi uniforms because they're modeled after the Nazi uniform. They carry wonderful little Nazi torches, and they hold up the portrait of Stepan Bandera, a Nazi, and they sing songs glorifying him. It happens every year here in America because that's where the Banderists fled to. They do the same thing in Canada. That's so effective in Canada, in fact, that their deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, is a Nazi. Her grandfather wrote a newspaper for the Nazis. She supports them. She was trained in the Nazi youth movement. That's that. In around 1956, after the death of Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev decided that he was going to rehabilitate people because, of course, Joseph Stalin was evil and bad and everything he did was wrong, including apparently putting 150,000 Banderist scum into the Gulag. And so they were released. And they were released into Ukrainian society. And what happens when Banderist scum comes back is they go into the shadows. They wait. And then they start to infiltrate their way up to the top. They start to pressure people. They start to get promoted themselves until they start taking over the reins of power. And who is running all of this? You got it. The CIA is running all of this. They're back there in the United States playing their little games in their computer, using Galen organization to stay behind unit, to maintain connectivity. They're paying the diasporas that are in Germany, Australia, America, and Canada to maintain connectivity. All this connectivity going on. They're coordinating the resurrection of the Banderist ideology inside Western Ukraine and all of Ukraine, with the goal of eventually ripping Ukraine from the Soviet Union, thereby weakening the rest of the Soviet Union, cause it to collapse. It's been a long time American strategic objective. And gosh, in 1991, it gets to happen. The CIA said, we won. So they stopped directly funding the Banderists because they didn't need to anymore. There's no need for a CIA covert operation because Ukraine is now independent. And so the diasporas take over and start funding the Banderists who are in Western Ukraine using money from, say, the National Endowment for Democracy and other non-governmental organization sources. And they do that, building them up. They maintain the connectivity. So in 2014, when the CIA decided that it was time to oust the constitutionally elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, and replace him with something America could support, the only thing America could support are the Banderists. And so they rise up and they take over. They're in place, and they've been in control ever since. Now, people say, well, wait a minute, Scott, Zelensky wasn't a Banderist. No, I said they were in control. Control means, for instance, when Zelensky gets elected president and says things like, I want to do something that's against the Banderists, they pull him aside and say, you'll be hanging by the neck until dead on the main avenue in Kiev if you even think about doing that. They're in control. The CIA is in control. We've been supporting Banderist scum since 1945. I hope that was a summary enough.
Scotty's on fire!